Hello students! Welcome to my virtual classroom. Today we are going to be talking about watercolor painting, introducing a unit on watercolor and figuring out all the different techniques that are used to create composition in watercolor. We'll be going through the planning stage, which includes drawing, setting up your materials, and just getting to know what you're working with and what kind of content you want to convey. So we'll talk about color palette, the actual painting process, and we'll talk about some techniques that can be used to create variation and some really fun effects within your paintings. So we'll get started. You always want to start with a detailed drawing. It's the most important part of watercolor painting is your drawing. The better foundation that you can set up for yourself, the more detail you'll be able to achieve in your final watercolor piece. Next, we're going to set up our palette. So when setting up our palette, it's important to remember the three primary colors. We've got red, yellow, and blue. And in the primary colors, we have a warm and a cool version. So with my red, I've got alizarin crimson, which is my cool, and then a cadmium red, which is my warm. For yellow, I've got just a regular yellow, which is my warm, and then a yellow ochre, which is my cool. And then in the blue range, I've got ultramarine, which is my cool, and cerulean blue, which is my warm. And then we've got neutral colors. So today we're going to be using hematite and Payne's gray for our neutralizers. First we'll do a wash with a gradient. And with our wash, we're also going to go from a darker value to a lighter value, forming a gradient. All right, and we'll just do a nice blue-green. So practice mixing colors on your palette. Lots of water. And we'll go right to the paper. And with a wash, it's really important that you get a big pool of water and you keep that pool continuously moving down so that you don't get weird blotches. So you can see I started with a pool and kept moving my brush so that I didn't get any spots where the paint pooled up inconsistently. So I have a nice even wash put on there. I'm going to create some variation and form a gradient by taking more saturated pigment and just going over the top. I'll build that up. And that creates a gradient. So next we'll be looking at a technique called wet on wet. You want to start with some water, and you want to get the entire space that you're trying to fill nice and saturated. This is why drawing is so important, because when you're painting in pure water, it's hard to see what's going on. So you've got a nice plan set out for yourself. So I've got lots of water on my palette, or on my paper. I'm gonna come in with a smaller brush, and we're just gonna do some color bleeding with our primaries. So I'll start with a red. And I just kind of fill that in. And be really loose and kind of gestural with it. You can see how the water is kind of carrying that pigment. I'll go ahead and pull up some of my yellow. And go in and almost let the water do the mixing for me. If you're not getting quite the effect you want, you can always go in and add more water. And then I'll go in with my blue. So again, let the water do the mixing for you. And get nice, clean variation in color. And that's wet on wet. So I've got fun watercolor effects. We'll look at saran wrap and how you can use that to kind of change the texture of your watercolor. So we'll start really wet water, saturated paint. And just make some kind of fun abstract colors on here, right? Really wet application, almost like we saw with the wet on wet technique. I'll take a regular old sheet of saran wrap, kind of crumple it up a little bit, and stick it right onto the paint. And we're gonna let it dry. Yeah. After you've allowed your paint to dry a little bit, it's safe to remove the plastic wrap. And you've ended up with this really neat effect. So we'll talk about resist techniques. I have laid down rubber cement in a design of my choosing, right? So we'll watch what happens when I overlay the paint on top. So you can see as I lay the paint over it, the rubber cement is keeping the paint from touching the paper, which is exactly what I want it to do, right? You can see I'm kind of blending my colors as I go, which can be really fun. Let's resist. So once that is dry, I will rub this rubber cement away and you'll get a nice bright white finish. And next we'll look at rock salts and the effect that that can have. So we'll lay down kind of a gradient. We're gonna go from dark to a lighter blue. Lovely dark blue value. So I'm taking coarse rock salt and I'm gonna put it directly onto the wet paint. You can see it already start to soak up some of that wet paint. So putting all of our techniques together now, I'm going to experiment with some color bleeding wet on wet, as well as kind of a gradient in the background. So we'll start with our lightest values. You always want to go light and then get darker. And we'll just do a nice neutral kind of background. Really, really light. I can't stress how important that is. So we'll give it this nice kind of cloudy, gray ambiance, right? If you find that you've got too much water on and you want to go a little bit lighter, you can take your rag, press it on there, lift some of that water and some of that color up. Next I'm going to go in with some color, do a wet on wet technique since this is already kind of wet from the wash that we've just put on it. And we'll just kind of go in and add some color where we might want it. Don't be afraid to kind of vary in the colors that you're putting down. Neutrals are your friend. And reds and oranges now. And don't be afraid to blend. If you get a little bit of brown, that's not a big deal. As you can see, I've already drawn what my design is going to be. And those lines are very apparent, so I don't lose my plan. The plan is so important. You'll start to kind of see when, to let your colors sit and when to let them bleed with each other. And now that I have my lightest values and then my wet on wet mixing on top, I'm gonna allow that to dry and just let my colors sit. So I've let my colors kind of bleed and dry, and you can see that my drawing is still apparent underneath. So to really add that fine detail into your painting over a nice, already dried, kind of fun abstract wash, we can then go in and start adding our really dark values, right? If you try doing this while the color is still wet, it'll just start to bleed with the rest of it. So it's really important to wait for it to dry. When dry brushing, you always want to make sure that your brush is not saturated with water, so thus the term dry brush. So even though you're dipping your brush in the water to, make the paint a little more viscous, you're not totally saturating it with water. And I'm giving my tree some branches. So once you've got everything where you want it to go, it's time to have some fun, right? Make it a little more alive, right? So we can go in with our brush, load it up with paper, give it a little flick. And got a nice splatter. Splatter the opposite direction, right? And last but not least, we'll go in and we'll add a little bit of details in the leaves, right? The most important thing in art is just to experiment and try things and practice, practice, practice. So this isn't gonna come straight away. You really gotta get to know your materials and just experiment with what they can do. These are just a few techniques, and I expect you all to find what works best for you and what speaks to you and what you want to create. Thank you so much for watching this demonstration. We will be creating experimentation sheets such as this. It's important to remember to clearly label what is going on where. It doesn't matter how you set up or organize your sheets, you just want to know what's happening in each square. So follow the instructions on the website and we'll see you in class.